Hello, my name is Nick, and I'm going to read a story. Um, it's in small chunks, so you won't have to sit there and fall asleep, or you might do. I don't know. But anyway, I would hope that you would enjoy it. And it's episodic. And if you do, give it a little ticky poo and subscribe to it, if you'd be so kind. Just to let me know how many people are actually listening. I'm rambling on here by myself. However, let's do it. So the story is about a ghost. So it's a ghost story, and it's not a up and down the spine tingly one. It's just a, well, I hope, humorous one. All right, having said that, let's get on with the damn thing, I say. Right, here we go. Take a deep breath. And it's called Kiyoshi and the Grumpy Ghost. And this chapter 1 is A Spectre Calls. Kiyoshi took a detour along the river back toward the park where Bartholomew's skeleton had been discovered. He ignored the weather. Wrapped in his thoughts, he tried to formulate in his mind the best course of action. He sat down on a bench. Any passer-by would assume that the forlorn character, seated alone in the middle of the park, was homeless or derelict or even on the verge of suicide. How did I get into this mess? He mumbled. His mind drifted back to where it all started. It was a cold January night. He remembered glancing at the clock. It was a minute to midnight. The sumo wrestling highlights of the day had finished moments earlier, and bed seemed an ideal choice. He heard his mother's snores from upstairs, almost the same volume as the roar of the wind, and withdrew his legs from beneath the electrically heated table he shared with Kuro, their cat. His balding head reflected the light from a nearby lamp as he leant down and pulled the plug on his companion's source of comfort. Kiyoshi was 42 years old, a teacher at the local school. He had been coerced by the headmaster to take on the task of English tutor, although equipped with sparse knowledge of the subject. He lived in a small coastal village 5 hours' drive from Tokyo, and shared with his mother a 2-bedroomed house that had been in the family for many years. Kiyoshi Hirota's life was unexciting. Mundane, a more appropriate description, demonstrated by his behaviour on school holidays, when he would spend most of his time either asleep or swilling beer at the izakaya, the local pub and eating house. He had fallen in love with Kaoru Endo, a young woman who lived in the same village, but due to his lack of confidence in his ability to woo the fair sex, his ardour remained unrequited. There was another problem. Kaoru was of Korean descent, and although his mother never said, he knew she would not approve. Mrs. Hirota was well into her 70s, but retained a remarkable amount of youthful vigour, and constantly reminded Kiyoshi that he was the last male in the family to carry on the Hirota name. Kiyoshi was aware of the genetic burden he carried in his loins, but refused to accommodate his mother when she arranged several introductions to various eligible females from good families. He had gone along with her in so far as he had agreed to meet the prospective brides, but declined to show further enthusiasm for any long-term commitment. At the back of his mind was sweet Kaoru, but fear of her rejection was the major stumbling block to his happiness. Oh, the tosser. He stood up, stretched, and yawned. I bet you're yawning now. The cat, from under the table, rotated its left ear, then returned it to its previous position. A loud knock on the front door caused both of his feline ears to face in the direction of the sound. Oh, pardon me. It was insufficient motivation to stir the creature, but evoked in Kiyoshi a grunt of disbelief that anyone would call at this time. Oh, that's a bit snory, wasn't it? Anyway, oh, yes. He stood undecided. Should he ignore it? The knock was repeated, this time louder. It was unusual, but his curiosity got the better of him. Who the hell is it? He muttered to himself. Oh, a cold gust of air lashed his face as he opened the door, but the shock of the icy blast diminished into total insignificance by the sight that beheld him. Oh, itchy bugle again, I'm so sorry. Framed in the doorway was a scruffy gaijin, foreigner, with long, unkempt hair and dirty clothes and tangled beard. Kiyoshi, in a state of shock, was able to discern movement of the concealed lips through the mass of hirsute growth. He felt his bowels contract, and with a supreme effort of will, managed to avoid total evacuation of his earlier meal. His emotional state fluctuated from panic to terror, and back to panic. Although a teacher of English, he regarded foreigners as odd, their behavior and customs strange, and their attitude towards Japanese people generally superior, sometimes prone to arrogance. He avoided any kind of contact where possible, or had once had the misfortune to be called upon to give directions to a large American who had stupidly, as Kiyoshi thought, gotten himself lost. Perhaps one reason he disliked social intercourse with native English speakers was that it demonstrated how poor his command of the language was. Like a lot of Japanese students of English, his written grammar was a lot better than many for whom it is their native tongue, but conversationally left a lot to be desired. Kiyoshi, with a supreme effort of will, stammered out the words, "Oh, what do you want?" Oh. The person spoke. His voice boomed out and drowned the weakly pitched question from Kiyoshi. The stranger addressed him in English. "I wish to converse with you on a matter of great importance," the voice requested. Replied Kiyoshi, his own voice in falsetto. The stranger repeated his question. Kiyoshi gaped and echoed his previous comment. "Prithee, sir, may I enter your abode? May I step in?" Kiyoshi's mind raced. He understood what was meant by step in and closed the door almost shut to reveal as little of his features. "Oh, you are Koshi Masada-san. He have a hotel. He look after. He live 2 doors left." Kiyoshi didn't wait for the gaijin's reply, but slammed the door as hard as he could in the man's face. He stood and listened for any movement. The wind made it impossible for him to discern anything of lesser volume. Boom, 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 boom. His heart pounded, and his intake of breath rapid as he strained his ears for any other sound than the north wind. He had heard about foreigners who attacked people asleep in their beds. None were to be trusted. Dastardly creatures. He remained against the door for 2 or 3 minutes. He was about to return to the living room to switch the light off, convinced that even at this moment the hairy savage had positioned himself on the doorstep of Mr. Masada, a man he didn't have a great deal of time for, and could now have the problem of how to deal with such an intrusion. When he heard a screech from Kuro, the obese feline, the apple of his mother's eye, give vent to a scream that sent a shiver down Kiyoshi's spine and once again tested his bowel control. He raced into the room and was met by the cat, its body even more rotund by erect follicles and fluffed up tail as it made an undignified exit. He heard the animal's claws rake the tatami, then a pause, and then a dull thud that communicated Pussy's head had come into contact with the door, which unfortunately had been locked by Mrs. Yorota before she went to bed. Where did they get up to now? I've lost the spot. There we are here now. Yes, silence. Kiyoshi entered the room, and despite another supreme effort on his part, evacuated his bowels. The sight that stimulated this lapse of control was that of the gaijin in the middle of the room, casually stroking his beard. Mother Nature has some strange ways in which she conducts her affairs. Kiyoshi's response, perhaps, were a good example. Its function practical if faced by some evil predator wishing to satisfy its hunger pangs. It gets rid of unnecessary weight and enables more rapid movement or retreat or whatever. It may also create rather an unpleasant odour to distract the attention of the attacker. Unfortunately, in Kiyoshi's case, it served no other purpose but to soil his underpants, and perhaps because of the loss of ballast, caused him to sink to the floor slower than he would have done a few seconds earlier. The stranger looked at the fallen man and shook his head. A brave heart indeed, he muttered. Well, that wasn't very much of a mutter, was it? A brave heart indeed, he muttered as he moved to the other side of the room. He waited. Kiyoshi remained where he fell, eventually to stir and rise on unsteady feet. He remembered the cause of his sudden lapse of consciousness and turned to face the man who stood quietly in the corner. "Feeling better, Abi?" the stranger asked. Kiyoshi's mouth was dry, and he felt the sensation of naked fear within him. "Go away now. You will go now. This is my house. I call the police. Call the police. Please control yourself. I have no desire to harm you. I wish only to enlist your aid." "What do you want?" Kiyoshi repeated slowly, as he tried to think how to handle the situation, still convinced that he and his mother would be found in the morning with their throats cut and their possessions stolen. "Listen to me. Just listen." The stranger leaned toward Kiyoshi and mouthed the words. Do you understand? Listen. Listen. Kiyoshi nodded, but couldn't find the required vocal energy to make a sound. The stranger drew himself up to his full height and began. What I am about to tell you will no doubt cause you to feel perhaps a little apprehensive of me. Oh, this was an unnecessary statement, for Kiyoshi could not have been more apprehensive if he'd tried. The stranger continued. I am, and I know that you would find this difficult to believe, a ghost, a spirit, a wandering soul seeking eternal rest from this accursed dimension that I once inhabited, but now have the misfortune to share with those of a more substantial composition. Kiyoshi listened to the stranger, but managed to decipher about a third of the man's words. His comprehension was better than his conversational ability, but still left a lot to be desired. He was puzzled as to how the gaijin got into his front room. He could only assume that he'd entered from the back whilst he waited and listened at the front. He understood the word ghost, but failed to register its implication in respect to the situation he now experienced. He put it down to the man being a complete madman, which added to the conviction of his and his mother's imminent demise. He wasn't the bravest of souls, as demonstrated by his sludgy underwear, but he began to formulate a plan. Next to the lamp was an umbrella, placed there by himself upon his return from the pub. The man would occasionally turn his back on Kiyoshi, pace about the room, then spin round to emphasize a point or check that he was still conscious. Kiyoshi feigned concentration and waited for the right moment. The man turned away, and Kiyoshi, with one swift movement, lunged at the umbrella, grabbed hold of the lower part, swung it in an arc, and brought the handle down with all the force he could muster on the stranger's head. Kiyoshi prepared himself for the impact of the instrument against the skull of the intruder. Instead of the dull thud of struck bone, there was just the swish of the umbrella's fabric as it sliced through the air, followed by a crack as the metal handle contacted the floor. The stranger turned in time to see the figure of Kiyoshi in the final stage of collapse. He shrugged, gave a sign of resignation, and regarded the prostrate middle-aged schoolteacher flat out on the floor. Minutes later, Kiyoshi regained his senses, sat up, and shook his head as if he tried to dislodge the events of the most recent past. The discomfort of the lower half of his anatomy and the unmistakable shape of the hairy foreigner, large as life in the sanctuary of his living room, reassured him that no matter how many times he shook his head, it would change nothing. Look, pray just sit there and listen. It is less distance to fall. As I was saying, I am a ghost, which no doubt you believe, as demonstrated by your departure from your senses after that futile attempt to strike me from behind with that instrument. I am in need of your assistance. I need your help. Do you understand? I need your help. It would be an excellent and comforting consolation for me. The ghost's visage loomed uncomfortably close to Kiyoshi's. The sight of several nose hairs protruding from the spook's nostrils presented themselves. Kiyoshi thought, although in a state of shock, he wondered why gaijin seem to have hairs grow out of wherever there is an orifice. Kiyoshi nodded and gaped in disbelief. Good. Let me explain. I am, or rather was, an English naval captain. We were at war with the Dutch, and I was picked up by an enemy vessel off the coast of China after my ship was sunk. Take no notice of that. I was on a return trip to England. Well, I'll have to stop there, because I've had this wretched thing from McPhee jumping up on the right-hand side of my screen, and it obliterates everything I'm trying to read. And also, it obscures my script. So, I apologize. I'll get that fixed because it's such a pain. I'll remember where I was, and I'll pick it up the next time we listen. That's if you want to listen. All right? I hope you stay with it, and please subscribe. Subscribe? Anyway, do what you want. I wish you a good day, and thank you for listening so far. Goodbye.